Welcome back to Fixity Fix. I'm David and Sarah is behind the camera. Today we're going to focus on learning more about porting and polishing cylinder heads. I've done this before and I've messed it up. I had a chance to learn a bunch of lessons and consulted with folks at Harmon's Machine Shop in Roanoke, Virginia. Got a lot of good tips, so we're going to work again on these brand new heads. And it'll be a few stages in the process that we'll get into after our catchy intro music.
Fixity Fix!
So the three steps are going to be polishing the combustion chamber. And you can see a chamber here that hasn't yet been polished. And then the rest of these, this is the unpolished chamber, and then the rest of these have been polished to the degree that I'm going to polish them. We're going to then do what's called bowl work or pocket porting, which means getting a grinder bit, a grinder burr down into these ports and being very careful not to touch the valve seats here and being careful around the valve guides, although we'll trim those down to increase airflow. And then the next phase is going to be gasket matching the exhaust ports to gaskets. You can see there's a significant difference between the diameter of the gasket hole and the cylinder head exhaust port, and we'll make those match to the degree we can without damaging the cylinder head or without violating the integrity of the heat management or channels throughout the cylinder head. We'll be doing the same gasket matching the intake ports as well. And another part of this is going to be removing all of these casting rough spots. You can see a rough spot right here, and then several rough spots inside. If you look inside the cylinder head bowls, you can see a bunch of rough casting marks there where my finger just was. Those will all get smoothed out. To begin with, I'll show you the process for smoothing out the combustion chambers. Here are the tools you'll need. A whole bunch of different lights, because you're going to want to see what you're doing. And I have, I think, 3 different types of light, as well as good ambient light from the outside. Safety equipment, you're going to want to have some type of mask, K95 or above. I'm going to use this paint respirator just because it's easy to pop on and off. You're going to want to protect your ears and your eyes and wear some type of gloves. I'm going to wear nitrile gloves because this is a high feel operation. Since you're using burr grinders, it may be good to wear even more protective gloves. You can do this with a Dremel tool, but I'm going to use a variable speed air burr grinder here. And it's going to be really important to have variable speed here. The slower the speed, the better finish you can get with a burr. For cast iron heads, you'll want a double cut burr like this one. You can see how there's crossed flutes on that one. For aluminum cylinder heads, you'll need a different kind. I have a set of long and a set of short of different profiles here. And these are for ferrous metals like iron. Non-ferrous metals like aluminum will take the single cut flutes. For polishing, it's good to have these cross buff wheels that go onto an air grinder like we have here, and we'll show that process too. It'll be a good idea to have gaskets, and these are old gaskets from when the engine came apart. A set of intake gaskets to do gasket matching for the intakes, and then a set of exhaust gaskets for the exhaust ports. A word of caution here, this truck has headers on it, and you can see a big difference with the gaskets that come with the headers and then the stock gaskets. If I were to gasket match to the header gaskets, I would be breaking the cylinder head, so you have to really look and see where the boundaries of the outside of the cylinder head are and make sure you're looking at all coolant channels and oil channels to make sure that you're not hogging out too much metal. So for that reason, we're going to go with the more conservative gasket match here with the stock. Well, this is actually a Felpro gasket. I like Felpro gaskets. I think they hold up better and are easier to use. But this one seems to be a good profile for this, and I'll still get a horsepower gain by getting an exhaust flow gain. I've also got a fan to blow air out of the shop, and then a shop vac to pull some of the slag away as I cut this metal. It's just gonna make a big mess. We'll start by working on smoothing and polishing the combustion chamber. This is upside down. The cylinder is here and the piston goes up and down right here, and the valves come through. So we have a set of old valves that are sacrificial valves in this case, because they're going to protect the valve seats in the cylinder head. We don't want to mess those up. Add a bit of oil to each valve stem just to keep the valve seats in good shape. I should be able to, puncture that box top with this valve. Doesn't really matter what type of oil here. I'm using gear oil in this thing. Okay, all right, those are going to protect the valve seats as I work around this. This takes a very light touch. The more metal you take off from the combustion chamber, the more you're going to interfere with your compression ratio. And if your compression ratio drops enough, it'll be a horsepower loss. That's the one area in porting and polishing a cylinder head where more metal off means reduction in horsepower. The reason it's done is to make heat management more efficient. So if this gets a little bit shiny, it reflects heat back into the cylinder and increases flow a little bit. So you can see I've had a very light touch just to make this a little bit shinier and to remove a lot of these lumps and bumps. You want to watch out for lumps and bumps that are significant here, because a sharp one is going to be a surface where heat can gather up and actually ignite the fuel at the wrong time in the timing cycle in the way a spark plug would. So that's an important part of this process. And these aftermarket heads are just a little bit rough cast, so we're going to take care of a lot of that as we go. Always keep oil in your air tools. For this part, we're going to gasket match the exhaust ports on this head. A lot of people will tell you to use die chem or machinist's die, and that's fine, and ascribe. My preference, from just having done this a couple of times and talked to some experienced machinists, is to just use paint. I'm using a Sharpie marker to mark off the difference between the wider stock exhaust gasket and the exhaust manifold here. And I'm probably not going to cut out the whole amount because I just don't want to risk breaching the cylinder head and then ending up ruining them. So it's important to get this on exactly right. And for exhaust gaskets that have steel on them, that's going to face the exhaust manifold, or the head, or the steel side is. The paper side faces the head itself. I'm going to put in a couple of bolts to hold it in place. I might have to get a few other bolts here just to get it seated properly. Get it as centered as possible. And the red is what we're going to end up cutting out. You can see how that's going to open up more flow, and more flow going through the head means more horsepower. Going to get that centered a little bit more, as if a bolt is in that one. Pressing down so we get a good stencil effect. We don't want this paint to bleed beyond the stencil of the gasket. Bleed much. It bled a little, so we'll leave a little bit of red behind. That's the advantage of using a scribe. This is a little more accurate. This is close enough. We just won't follow any of the bleed lines when we're cutting. For this exhaust port, you can see I have my vacuum hose routed so it's going into the open exhaust valve just to pull out what I'm grinding out of here to do the gasket matching. And I'm going to go in about 3/4 of an inch and then just smooth everything into that port, and then later we'll go into the port and remove some of the casting areas that protrude, except for the ones that are obviously the bottom end of a threaded screw port for the valve cover, for example. We don't want to cut through those. cylinder head before pocket porting, looking in those bowls. And then here's one after. You can see that the rough spots have been taken out and things have been polished. The valve guides have been narrowed for a little bit better airflow. All that means more flow, and more flow means more horsepower. The finished pocket ported head and the unfinished, unported one. You can see all kinds of junk in the casting here. All that gets smoothed out with a combination of burrs and helical sanding tips here. Those are 120 grit that I use after I burr everything down. Then of course give the combustion chamber just a little bit of a polish. Another way to mark the intakes or exhaust ports for gasket matching is to place the gaskets on, get them in place, and then hit them with some spray paint like a stencil. You can have these tanked at the machine shop after you do porting anyway, so all that paint's going to come off and out. And you just cut away where the paint ends up. Seems to end up with a much clearer mark than with the Sharpie method. I think I'll be using this one from now on. We've ported the exhaust, and now we'll switch to porting the intake. And the intake side looks like this, and you just saw how I marked it with spray paint this time, a little more precise than the Sharpie way. So before porting intakes or exhaust for that matter, you want to be careful that you understand how oil and coolant and air flow through the head. This head for the Ford 2.9 and probably lots of other Ford engines only has this one restrictive oil port coming up through the center of the rocker arm cradle. And so this goes down into the bottom of the head, but it's going to travel through this area here. So when we're porting, I've made this mistake before and it's not pretty. Don't cut this off because this is how the oil gets up to the top of the head, and if you cut through it, oil's just going to come down and burn in this cylinder, and it'll ruin the head. This protuberance right here, what is it? Protrusion? This protrusion right here is cast in and is the bottom of one of the bolt holes, one of the many bolt holes going through. So you really want to just leave alone anything that's coming through. Now you could make an argument that these are superfluous, but I wouldn't want to cut through them and then end up having a hole that restricts airflow, or worse yet, ruins the head. We won't cut in video from gasket matching the intake ports because the process is identical to gasket matching the exhaust ports. So what we're going to do is get in here and clean up any rough castings. This is a rough casting on the intake port here. We're going to scrape that clean. We're also going to ease any sharp corners. We are not going to touch any of the 3 steps of the valve seat. So a lot of people will grind this down right to this valve seat, and that's just the wrong way to go. You want to actually have a little bit of a shoulder here because that creates a vortex effect, and it's as much about speed as it is about volume. So you have to be careful not to reshape the shape of the bowl here. I'm going to be cutting away a lot of this valve guide to give it sort of a shark fin for air to flow past it on here on the intake port, and the same thing on the exhaust port. We're going to leave alone this area so we have a little bit of a ridge here on the exhaust port and just smooth everything out, so you can watch that process next. I'm going to use this die grinder with this somewhat pointy double cut bit. You could also use sandpaper rolls, and they're graded from 40 up to about 120 or 220. It's a little more forgiving and doesn't take as practiced a hand as one of these die grinder bits. So once you've worked your bowls with the different profiles of burr grinders to your satisfaction, and generally I just try to cut away all of the casting mess and get it pretty smooth. Then the exhaust ports need to be smoother than the intake port. If the intake port gets too smooth, if you go for a mirror finish, the fuel is going to come out of atomization, just like if you're taking a shower and you've got steam in your bathroom and the steam hits the mirror, it's going to fog up the mirror. You don't want your fuel to do that. You want your fuel to stay in atomization. So I typically only sand up to just a little bit with 120 on the intake port. On the exhaust port, you can go as shiny as you want because you want the exhaust to flow out freely and it's not going to get stuck or deatomized. There's no atomization to the smoke. So I'll use a combination of these sanding rolls or these cross buffs, and I just go up to medium. I just use a medium cross buff and go all through the ports and the bowls. And again, you have to be very careful to stay off of the valve seats. These heads are going to go in and be tanked, and they're also going to get a valve job, so it's okay if you nick it a little bit. That'll get fixed by the machine shop. And then I'll usually hit the tops of the combustion chambers with just a little bit of sandpaper or cross buff, but again, be very conservative about what you take off of the combustion chamber because that'll interfere with your compression ratio. And the heads are back from being tanked and given a valve job at the machine shop. Here's a few observations. This 2.9 engine, and this is one of the controversies about this engine, gets oil through one little 3/8 inch diameter hole here in the center stand to which the rocker arm assembly bolts. So the oil flows up and then into this rocker support cylinder. These engines are notorious for lifter clatter and noise, and it's often attributed to oil issues, and there are several different reasons why there are top-end oiling issues. One is this small hole. Sometimes those get clogged or obstructed. Sometimes it's the cam bearings that are the issue. And interestingly, if you're ever taking these heads apart, it's really important to pull apart this rocker arm assembly and clean it thoroughly. These pins come out and then you have to pull the whole thing apart, and this was just full of schmectagus. It was just full of waxy substance. It could have been from poor maintenance in the engine over the years, and it could have been from certain oils that just leave waxy residue that builds up, but it's essential that oil flow in here is maintained. And if you've got a 2.9 that's got a noisy lifter, it's pretty important, I think, to pull this off and give it a good cleaning and see if that gets the oil where it needs to go. Sometimes that seafoam treatment just isn't going to be enough. We'll get all this bolted back on the engine and fire this thing up and see how it goes this time. The wisdom of folks who know this better than me say that it's the pocket porting that's actually inside of the valve bowls that's going to make the most difference. Now, I did all that and of course was very careful not to violate the oil passage here where the oil needs to pass up through the head and into this rocker assembly. Thanks for watching. If you find this sort of content helpful and you like watching it and it's entertaining to you, then you're weird. And hit subscribe, and please give us a like. And of course, give me comments. I'm here to learn just like you are. Love for you to share your wisdom below. Thanks.